Hi, everybody. Nice to see everybody. One day soon, all in person. Anyway, really delighted you could join us. Our speaker today is somebody I've been following the work of for a number of years right now. She's definitely a leader in globally helping us think about AI, ethics, and society. Is Joanna Bryson. She is a professor of ethics and technology at the Hertie School in Berlin. She earned her PhD in computer science at MIT. And then I think was at Bath in the UK for some time, and at Princeton. And as I mentioned, a globally recognized leader in AI policy and ethics, and has published, venues, as I'm told here, ranging from Reddit to science. So I think that you are covering all bases there. As of July 2020, she's one of the 9 experts nominated by Germany to the Global Partnership for Artificial Intelligence. And for those of us who are lawyers and policy people in the audience, I'll emphasize that I think Joanna has been one of the strongest voices on the point that we actually have a lot of tools that we already could be using for AI governance and regulation. And I think that's an important message. And she's going to talk to us today about bias, trust, and doing good. So go ahead, Joanna.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. All right, fantastic. Yes, thanks a lot for having me. And I absolutely love talking about regulation, and we could talk some more about that in Q&A. But the origins of this talk, it's actually, I've only given it a couple of times before, but it was because somebody asked me to talk at a Women in Science meeting, and then they asked me to talk about ethics. And I was like, damn it, I'm a woman in science. So I just decided, I don't know why I didn't know this before, that a whole lot of my recent science was really relevant to AI ethics. It was sort of 2 different parts of my academic repertoire. So this is my attempt to bring it together. And like I said, this is a relatively new way for even me to think about my work. And so I found it, hopefully it'll be a little more useful if I start out making clear some of the common ground here. So the basic point here is that ethics isn't window dressing. This is a paper we have under review right now. That's just the amount of vitriol that people are pushing against AI ethics, and some of it is some and there's no question some people are using some aspects of AI ethics as window dressing. But the point is that real ethics, when you get to the basis of it, it's part of the way we hold our society together, right? It is a form of policy, and it can be improved by scientific understanding, right? And again, that challenges how some people think of the origins of ethics, but I'm going to be functionalist here. So AI is not, the other thing, and this is what Jillian just said, AI is not an enormous exception. It's actually an ordinary extension of human communication technology. It folds into how we govern, and policy and errors and solutions that we've made in the past are relevant to the problems of handling AI and governing AI now. And then finally, this is the last of my starting points, is I would claim that we are actually making really interesting progress in updating our ethics in the light of the affordances of AI. And I would argue that's what we need to do. Of course, there will be some changes to governance, but also how we conceive of ourselves and how we hold our societies together as a consequence. So speaking of how we do all that, let's talk about these baselines. So this is actually the principles. It was originally the OECD principles of AI. It's the first 5. There's a larger document, but these 5 principles were also signed up to by the G20. So I'm just realizing something. There we go. So the G20. I'm sorry to interfere with this slightly, but you could try pinning the version of me that's coming from my camera instead of my laptop, even though I'm talking on the laptop, and that might be more interesting for people instead of just seeing my name. Okay, but anyway, where were we? OECD, right? Yeah. So G20. Let's just go over these. Okay. So AI should benefit people and the planet by driving inclusive growth, sustainable development, and well-being. Very nice way to think about already framing this in terms of sustainability. We had the second one is the AI systems should be designed in a way that, now believe me, it's hard to get through some people's heads that AI even is designed, especially when you have leaders like Andrew Ng saying, oh, we don't program anymore, we just get the data and then the AI codes itself. Not helpful. So yes, AI systems should be designed in a way that respects the existing rule of law, human rights, democratic values, and diversity, right? Now, I want to say, up to about 2 or 3 years ago, we were just trying to guess what ethics was. We didn't know what was going on. And all of a sudden, people like Phil Alston came around and said, hey, you know, we've spent about 70 years working out human rights in the UN. Why don't you use that? And sorry, I accidentally lift a messaging platform up. All right. Where are we? Sorry. So we all basically said, yeah, sounds like a good plan. Okay, so where were we? There should be transparency, responsible disclosure around AI systems. Again, this is one of my areas of specialty within the systems engineering of AI. It's just perfectly possible. And again, if you're wondering about that, go ahead and ask in Q&A at the end. But the point is that people need to be able to understand, among other things, when they are engaging with AI, and they shouldn't be deceived about the nature of the systems they're talking to. And then AI systems must function in a robust, secure, and safe way. Again, just like any other manufactured product. And again, the AI is a product. I would argue it is a product, even if it performs a service. But this is unfortunately not totally clear in European law. So it's ambiguous. So I think this is one of the things we could really do, legislatures could really do, is clarify that, of course, it's a manufactured product. And what I love, this is from the European Union, actually, this thing about that when you have AI inside of an artifact like a car or a light bulb, then you have to guarantee that it's cyber secured for the entire period of the expected lifetime of that artifact. So it isn't that the car company gets to say, oh, you just have to buy a new car now because the cybersecurity is over. The EU will go out and figure out that people normally have cars for 13.3 years, and that's how long the cybersecurity has to be sound. And hopefully that will stop people from putting light bulbs and things on the internet, which is not worth maintaining for that long. Anyway, and then finally, the organizations and individuals developing, deploying, or operating AI systems should be held accountable, including that means you should be able to tell who they are for their proper functioning in line with the above principles. So what these things talk about is that AI should be human-centered. You may have heard a lot about that. Just, transparent, safe, and accountable. And so we have all these nice things, and then we also have this other nice thing, which I just sort of mentioned, the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, which people spend a lot of time putting together. They're pretty cool too. And we also have the Global Partnership for AI, which Canada and France started. It sort of came out of the G7, interesting history. Again, we'll talk about that in the Q&A if you want, but I think I've already dragged it a little bit here. But I will say one of the things that as one of what we in the Global Partnership have to do, we have to justify the things we do in terms of the OECD principles and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Everything we do has to meet both of those. All right. So despite all that, we still are running up with situations like this. And so one of the questions people have, and I want to say it's not just to pick on North America, this is something that happened last week in Denmark, more or less, but you could see that the Germans were kind of excited about it, some of the Germans, which was to say that there shouldn't be a part of Denmark that has more than 30% non-Western people in it. Okay, so you might see this as a way to de-ghettoize cities, but I mean, if you just think about like how are you defining this, and also what does it mean in the limit case? It's just, yeah, anyway. So is all this anything to do with AI? And I'm just going to suggest something along these lines.
And we have an army, okay, as a soldier and as a general, as a retired general. We have an army of digital soldiers. what we are now, what we call, I call them, because this was an insurgency, folks. This was run like an insurgency. This was irregular warfare at its finest in politics. And that story will continue to be told here. But we have what we call citizen journalists. Because
so anyway, in case you didn't recognize that, that was General Flynn, and yeah, word salad was not just something about Trump, it was something that Trump liked, but he actually was taking money from, I guess he was being paid by Cambridge Analytica as an advisor, and he was bragging about running an insurgency against his own country, right? But you hear the emphasis, and that was about the first of 2016 election, bragging about the use of AI tools to achieve their goals. So it has something to do with it. All right. So I'm now going to actually hit the science part of my meeting. That was all just sort of motivation and framing. The first thing I want to talk about is public goods. Now this is kind of, I wanted to do science, and I showed a picture of science sci-fi writer and well, a philosopher or sci-fi writer. And they talk about something called the intelligence explosion, or sometimes superintelligence, among other things. So the idea is that a self-improving intelligence, something that is able to learn, would create this incredible explosion. It would just it would exponentially, in fact, that's one of the characteristics about it, is that the exponential growth of exponential on exponential, leading to unexpected side effects. So if you can accept that intelligence can be decomposed, okay, now this is not actually my normal definition of AI. I often talk about it being the whole process of going from perception to action. But if you use sort of the Russell and Norway definition that motivates that large book, then you could say that if we accept that action, perception, motivation, memory, learning, reasoning are all parts of AI, then I would argue that everything that we've built, every artifact, and especially writing, have been examples of AI, because they're all facilitating our capacity to take intelligent action. So we as a system, we and our machines are becoming more and more intelligent, right? So yeah, in that case, if you talk about writing, we've got 12,000 years of AI. And I would argue we're the intelligence explosion. So there's nothing wrong with the reasoning except for projecting it into the future. And so here's your exponential. And now we all know these log, even if you're a lawyer, sorry, joking, lawyers, we all are used to log scales now. This is a log on a log, right? Up until 10,000 years, up until 10,000 years ago, there was only on the order of 1 million people, hominids. We were being beaten by the macaques. Okay, we were on a lot of continents, but we weren't doing that well. And then when we got this stuff together, suddenly we're taking over all the biomass on the planet. It's a little scary, actually. So how can we possibly support so many people? Well, it turns out the world is not a zero-sum game. It's something called, there's something called public goods that allows us to increase the carrying capacity of a space. Okay, so when are we good? When do we actually choose to cooperate? You can think about, for all of life, that there's two kinds of problems, which we could label sustainability and inequality. So the sustainability problem is how big of a pie. We're not supposed to talk about size. Hi. We're not supposed to be talking about size anymore. It's not about growth, but anyway, think about how rich of a pie, right? So how can we improve the pie? And then the second thing is inequality. How big a slice of the pie does everybody get, right? And so cooperation is when you see a way to make the pie better, and competition is when you don't see a way to make the pie better, or even if you do, you don't care, and you go after trying to increase your slice. All right. So if we cooperate, the hypothesis here is that when we can see a way to grow the pie, and that's going to be easier to do than fighting is going to be, then we're going to go for cooperation. Otherwise, if we don't see an option, especially if we're worried about starving, we're going to compete. Okay. So one of the cool things about AI and this technology in general is that it's really good for searching. So when you increase your capacity to communicate, you expect to find more cooperative equilibria, and that's actually a biological principle that was documented in, or first the theoretical biology that came out in Science around 2007. All right, speaking of 2007, 1 year later, there was a paper about punishment of those who give things to the public good. Okay, so again, a little bit of context here. There have been some papers that claimed that the thing that made humans special, the reason that we had so many public goods, was our willingness to punish those who wouldn't give to the public good. Now, this is kind of cyclic, right? Because actually taking the effort to punish those who weren't contributing to the public good is also an altruistic act. It's contributing to the public good by taking that extra effort. But anyway, this guy, so Simon Gachter is one of the people that had been leading in that area. But Benedict Herman was sitting there listening to it on the radio in Switzerland. And he was actually a German who had worked in Russia. And he said, I don't believe Russians punish anyone. They allow all kinds of things to happen. I don't believe that's a cultural universal just because some undergrads at ETH do it. So he went out and tested it. And it turned out he was like part wrong and part right. So the part wrong is the dark green on this graph. So you see that there's a bunch of cities. They went to the leading universities of each city and they ran it on the different undergraduates. And in every city, you find a lot of people that will punish those who don't give as much as they do to the group when there's an opportunity. This is all in experimental economics. So they can actually quantify and say, how much are you willing to give to the group? And you can see that basically, if you don't give as much as the person has the opportunity to punish, that person will generally punish you in any country. But what's interesting is that there's a bunch of countries where they punish those who do give to the public good. That's the red, okay? And then this is 2008, if you remember the Greek crisis at that time, the Athens here, there was a few places where they punished everybody, right? So this made no sense from the standard biological, like, oh, public goods, that story I just told you, right? So they tried to figure out what's going on. And one of the things they figured out was that there's a correlation here, anti-correlation for antisocial punishment with GDP and the rule of law. And that kind of, what you could get from that is that maybe rule of law and GDP are forms of public goods. Or maybe you need to have enough assets around that you can afford to have public goods like the rule of law. But you can also see that when you have the rule of law, it would make more sense to contribute to public goods because they're going to be better defended. So anyway, this is social sciences like this. These things are hard to just confound, including that GDP and rule of law are highly, highly correlated. All right. So now what I'm doing here, so that was all Benedict Herman's work with Tony and Gachter. Now I'm taking that data and I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees, which is not the most exciting thing I'm going to do, but just so you know. And so the only North American city here is Boston, which was on the top before, now it's on the left. And what this graph is showing you is that we're taking of all the people that were playing this game, these economic games, these experiments. Oh, good, great, thank you. I thought you guys were probably missing, I mean, like my name is exciting, but anyway, great. So where were we? The pink color on the bottom there is people who just didn't bother to punish anyone, all right? And then the green is what I told you before about those who were willing to punish those who gave less than they did to public good. But the interesting thing here is that the purple at the top is people that punish anyone randomly, right? They're just everybody. And the blue is the only people actually doing that antisocial punishment we were talking about, that everybody was excited about how I could explain that. And given that the groups, which you don't know this, I didn't tell you, that the groups are 4 people in a group, you can see that it's basically looks like, for whatever reason, it's totally independent whether you punish competitively, that's very antisocial, whatever, and you give the least amount in the group. But if you do happen to give the least amount in the group, then you can only punish antisocially. So I think that basically there's only 3 strategies here. The antisocial isn't a strategy, it's a side effect of the group size. But the free riding on punishment is one strategy, which that's Harvard. The Harvard, like, they're just like, why should I care what the other people do, right? And but most of the antisocial punishments actually derive from mixed strategies. Those people, I would argue, are trying to grow their slice, whereas the people that were punishing those who weren't contributing as much as they thought they should to public good, those people are trying to grow the pie. Okay, so and then the people at Princeton was the same. I was there for a couple of years, and like whenever I would give a talk about this data, they'd be like, why doesn't anybody put any money into that? Okay, you guys are just like Harvard. And actually, unfortunately, that's not just about Princeton and Harvard and Ivy League or whatever. From colleagues who do work in this area, that it seems it's a North American thing, actually, at least United States thing. We'll talk about the difference in the United States and Canada later, actually. But anyway, I do want to emphasize that they're growing their slice and growing their pie. Right. So part of what might be going on here is that people in some parts of the world, especially with low GDP, may not feel that much like they're all in the same group. So it may be that they're willing to expend a lot of resources on their own group, but they aren't that happy to invest in this random group of people they've been thrown in together with. And that was actually one of Herman's hypotheses. Yeah, anyway, I think I'm going to just, so I'll accelerate a little bit. So anyway, this whole thing about splitting stuff up and fighting over pies and things, split into groups, other chimpanzees do that too, okay? So, and this is like Jane Goodall was one of my heroes as a kid, right? So that you can have chimpanzees that they've known each other all their lives, and then the group gets basically too big. They split up into two different groups, and then they're just coexisting peacefully next to each other. And then something happens. And what Wilson, Bosch et al. In 2014 showed was basically the thing that seems to happen is there's not enough resources. Chimpanzees are starving, and they attack the other group. One of them attacks the other, and they kill them off one by one, and then they take over the territory. So this is the chimpanzee wars, which again, famously Jane Goodall started documenting, and now the cause does seem to be resource constraint. People though don't just split into two groups, right? And also we don't only have this happen once in a while and then stop talking to each other very much. So I'm sorry, I'm very bad at drawing. In fact, I didn't even draw this. But anyway, this is meant to be androgynous, not male. But anyway, so hopefully, I hope that you're bubbling with someone, that you have a family. If you're lucky, you certainly have neighbors, whether or not you're allowed to have picnics with them, or even if you do when you are allowed to. Probably everyone here has some kind of co-workers that they're working with. And then again, if you're lucky and you take the time, you may have some kind of club you belong to, and you're not bowling alone. So we have lots of identities, okay? And so now this comes back to trust. All right, so well, this is jumping around, but it'll make more sense towards the end. So when you, sorry, whoa, I forgot how bad that jump is, but we will come back to that idea in just in the next section. Sorry about that. So measuring trust. This is another one of these economic games. And that's it. I won't have to explain any more. Well, maybe one more. Economic games. Sorry about that. Anyway, this one is really weird. This one, you have somebody who is the original subject, and you give them money, right? And then you say to that subject, hey, subject one, you can take your money and go home. I'm an economist. I don't believe in experiments without real money. It's real money. You can take it. You can go home. Or I can give that money, in fact, not that money, 3 times as much money to another subject that you're never going to meet. You don't know who they are. You don't know anything about them. But then I'll tell that subject that if they want to, they can give you some money back. All right. So, and then the question is, what happens? So you should all think about what you would do. I bet you're all Canadian nice, and you'd be like, yeah, let's do that. Okay. So anyway, subjects one do actually tend to trust A if they know nothing about them. Okay. But to trust subject 2. But if they do know something about them, if they know that subject 2 isn't going to give them half the money back, but rather, or more than half, that's okay, but it's rather going to give them less than half, but still more than they had originally. So like, let's say instead of getting 1.5 times as much as they're going to have, they're only going to get 1.2 times as much. They tend to say, no, I'd rather, so that's again a form of punishment. It's like, you aren't good enough for me. I'd rather give up money than let you take money you don't deserve. Okay. So this was already known in the literature. What we did, this is with a PhD student, Paul Rauwolf, was that we looked at trying to explain how this could come about through evolution. Okay, and here we mean cultural evolution, so not biological evolution necessarily. Yes, subject 2 does know that. Okay, so, so to answer the question there. Okay, so there's two independent parameters that we're going to be looking at. One is how many partners do you get to choose between? Okay, and the second one is how much information do you have about those partners? So what is the probability that you know the return rate, what proportion of the money you get back from your partner? Okay, and then there's 3 parameters we're going to allow to evolve. Now, what I mean evolve here is that after every turn, you look around your neighbors and you say, who has the most money? I want to be more like them. Okay, so that's cultural evolution. It's pretty simple. It's just like you're just looking around because the whole situation's too complicated. You can't figure out the right thing to do, so you just look and see who seems to be winning right now, and you imitate them. Okay, so the 3 things that you're imitating about are trust. So that's how likely you will be to invest. If you're subject 1, how much you would invest, how likely you are to invest in subject 2. The return rate. So if you're subject 2, how much do you give back? All right. And then finally, the demand. So remember that thing about subject 1 won't give it to someone who's not giving enough back. So what do you think is enough? Okay, so these are the 3 things that we're hypothesizing need to be evolved. And actually, again, those variables had already been mentioned by Manafat and Rand. They just hadn't shown, in fact, they were dubious about whether you could evolve it, and we evolved it. Okay, so the here's these parameters again, the 2 parameters that are set by the experiment, the 2 different conditions. So if you have the y-axis is how much information do you have about the subject 2, and the x-axis is how many partners have you got. And what you see here is that if you have too much information, then you're not going to trust, you're never going to evolve trust because you don't need it. You don't need trust if you know what's going to happen. Trust is about like letting things go without your control. You also never get, I don't know if I have an arrow for this, you also never get trust building up if you don't have enough information. So that's kind of interesting too. So you can't bootstrap it. Also, you don't have as much trust if you don't have any choice, because basically you can be exploited then. so you just aren't going to build the system up. So the most trust is happening in the situation where you have less information, middling amounts of information and some partner choice. And the reason, let me show you why there's that weird slopey thing at the top. Basically, if you have a certain proportion probability of knowing stuff about people, and then you have more and more people, then you're probably going to be able to find at least one person you want to trade with. And so that's why that there's like very little trust in that upper right corner. But you can see this is the rate of return, right? The people in that upper right, they know, everybody knows everything about them. So they just have to give all the money back. Look at that. That's not fair, right? That's 0.9. Nobody gives 0.9 back in the real world. So this is this evolved system, but it's a simulation, right? So the thing that's more realistic, like I said, in the real world, we see these rates being more around like 0.5. So you can see that sort of light gray band that's going across the middle, that's more realistic. All right, so looking at the parameters that gave us those more realistic values, we then ran a simulation over time. And this explains why the economists hadn't figured this out already. Okay, it's like it's an advantage to be a computer scientist and do simulations, because it's not stable. So that context, all those contexts that we just talked about, tends to drive you up, tends to drive, you can see trust goes very high. The demand rate is about 0.5, like you would expect. And the return rate is pretty high. But once in a while, it looks like the return rate, there's just a huge defection, and then trust eventually, some proportion of that time, trust plummets. Right, so you don't, and this graph just happens to look like it stabilizes. It doesn't. Okay, and sometimes it's all broken for longer than this looks like. Okay, so but anyway, that paper came out in the Student Journal. But this paper actually was a CogSci conference paper that has a bug in it, so please don't download it or you can, but just there was a mistake. But anyway, I thought when I looked at that graph on the upper right where they're giving all their money away, I thought, oh my God, that's terrible. Those people are being really exploited. This is like, this is what happens with too much information, and the ICT is going to do this, and people are going to be exploited. But it turns out that the highest, so I re-implemented the simulation that Paul had written, and I also checked for inequality. And it turns out actually that what happens is it's when people start defecting on the return rate. So so basically evolution has noticed that trust is so high that you can get away with not giving that much money back. And so then people do that for a while, and there's this plummeting because the people who are not giving it back are getting so much money until the people that were trusting stop trusting, right? So there's spikes of inequality are happening during those periods. So that to me led to a new idea. When you talk about investors, you think like, oh, those guys must have money, right? But I realized that, well, maybe the right way to think about it is that the people, the subject ones, are endowed by their creators with a certain amount of capacity, and then the investees are actually the institutions that decide how much to give back, what portion of the labor to be rewarded. So maybe we should think about labor as being endowed with a potential investment, can work on their own or trust an institution to gain better return. Institutions compete on return rate, but only if there's partner choice and incomplete information, right? Which I still think is important. Periodically, they defect and they exploit labor until labor, says no and finds another configuration. Maybe. As long as we're on this topic of the future of work, I just want to point out another thing, which is a forthcoming paper. It might be out then, I should check. But Parallel here, that he was trying to talk about how important unions were. But I was in this meeting on the future of work, and I'm seeing this talk, and these RTI means repetitive task index or something. So it's the tasks that you would expect robots could take, right? These very simple repetitive things. And so so they're all talking about, oh, look at that big gap. But I'm like, wait, why are the wages only going down between 1983 and like 1995? That makes no sense. If these are robotics tasks, there wasn't that much that happened in robots in that period. And he said, we economists have a theory. I'm bashing economists now, sorry. We economists have a theory that nothing's happened in AI since about 2000. And I'm like, that's a really bad theory. So anyway, what I think actually is going on there is what David Otter says, if you've read his thing about why there's still so many jobs. That was the period where in the United States, and these are US statistics, that the opening of the world trade, the opening of the Chinese market suddenly meant that you were competing with Chinese labor. And the interesting thing is that the similar thing happened in Germany, but later. So starting in 1990 and going to about 2000, you had this decline in wages and a weakening of the unions. They had to agree to stop national level bargaining. And the reason for that was the fall of the wall. Everybody thought that was great, but it meant that suddenly there was access to a whole bunch of people that worked for a lot less money that were very close by as well. So the automobile manufacturers could easily have relocated. So the upshot of all this is, machines don't lower wages, people do. But I will say that I think that AI is contributing to some of the problems with wages, well, in two different ways, actually. But the one I'm talking about right here is that you make people more exchangeable by helping them out. So we can use technology to help people be more empowered, but as there's more people that can perform tasks, then that actually reduces wages. So that might be why a lot of the wages are flattening out. But of course, there's this other problem, which is that people that, some of the people that are in certain industries are having this massive increase in wages, which I think that's partly to do with underregulated sectors. They're not paying enough tax and they have so much money chasing relatively few people. But anyway, let's talk about bias instead. Okay, so now this is where, remember the chimps? I'm sorry that I skipped around this way. I don't know why I did it this order. Oh well, maybe I'll fix it. So back to the chimps. In other chimps, as I mentioned, Groups split off when they get to be too large to be able to keep a group together. And we talked about the war thing already. So the thing I was saying about all these the public good stuff, about all the groups, the identities that we can have, that we're able to do something much more complex. We can find more public goods, and we can also have more varieties of group size. And within our lives, we can easily create multiple groups to exploit different kinds of resources. And so these identities are a ready way to decompose, to take advantage of a situation, to try to exploit a particular resource, but also potentially to fight, right, when there's not enough resources. And I'm going to argue that this is one of the things that people are calling bias, is identities, this propensity to decompose into identities along identity lines. Now, I don't like to call it bias because in machine learning, bias is not a bad word. Bias is actually regularities. You're looking, it's what you want. You're going through all this data and you're trying to find regularities, right? So that's not the problem. The problem is the subset of bias that we call stereotypes, all right? And so from the work that I did, which I'm about to come to, I'll tell you about a little more in a minute, but from the work that I did with some colleagues at Princeton, we indicated that the right way to think about stereotypes is it's just a subset of all the biases, all the regularities out there that we as a society have signed up and said, look, no, we don't want that to be that way anymore, okay? Prejudice is acting on stereotype. And again, the slide I'm about to show you will indicate that you can't help having stereotyped, but you can, that's what we ask people to do, stop acting on it, right? And so prejudice is the problem, not bias, not even stereotype. Okay, so prejudice is the actually bad thing. And in case that wasn't really clear, here's an example. So bias is, that like, if you're talking about programmers, knowing everything about programmers, everything you've ever, this isn't like looking it up in dictionary. It's just like, what does the word mean to you? It's going to mean all the stuff you've ever noticed, every programmer you've seen in a movie, every programmer you've met, everything you've read about them in the newspaper. And you'll probably pick up on the fact that most of them are male, okay? Now, this was actually one of the really distressing things about this paper for me, because when I was a programmer, I was a professional programmer in the 80s. I worked in the financial industry in Chicago, don't hate me. But anyway, there was like, I don't know, 11%, and it was growing. It peaked, I don't remember, like 17% of programmers were women before the dot-com crash. And now it was like 4 or 5% in the stats from 2016. It was shocking. If you're a woman and you're looking for a great job, programming is fun. I don't understand. Anyway, so the point is the stereotype part is just that part about programmers being male. We don't want only men to program. And then prejudice is if you act on the stereotype. So if you say only males need to apply, then that's when you're in real trouble. Okay. All right. So given all that, let's talk about semantics. So where did all this stuff about bias come from? All right. If we're trying to understand what a word means, one of the hypotheses that these old white guys gave was that a word's meaning is no more or less than exactly how it's used. Now that sounds cyclic again, but it's surprisingly accurate for thinking about semantics. Because what you're basically saying is that you look at a bunch of words, like here's a bunch of words, which are actually telling you something, okay? And I'm going to talk about what does semantics mean, all right? So I want to figure out what it means. Well, meaning is going to be relative, and words that have similar words next to each other are going to be the ones that mean more like the same thing, okay? So I'm counting up a vector. I'm looking at fairly frequent words. So if you use the 75 most frequent words, then you wind up with just a syntax, like, oh, it's a verb, oh, it's a noun, not interesting. All right, but if you use the second most frequent 75 words, you got pretty good statistics about how the words actually relate to each other. So I might have a big vector where I can say, oh, every time the word normal, if I'm trying to understand a word like semantics, does the word normal occur within 5 words of it? Yes, it does. Okay, does the word occur? Yes, it does. Does the word cat appear? No, it doesn't, right? And so you just tick up the counts. And this was a big deal in the 90s, you know, the giant amounts of RAM that we had to do this. This is all nothing now. And so then once you have these big vectors of counts, you get these surprisingly accurate semantics from just looking at how far were the different words, these counts. You can think of counts as a vector, and I'll draw a picture of that, but only in 2 dimensions. Let's say that the 2 words we were counting, like the occurrence for, were hat and obscure. So those are our things that we're counting in those vectors. And then the words we're trying to understand the meaning of are scholar, paper, and rock, okay? So the idea from this picture is that you have hat occur near to rock more often than paper, and then to scholar, right? So there's just more counts that way. And similarly, obscure occurs more often for, oops, I actually said that wrong. So rock is fewer than paper. But anyway, you can see what I'm talking about. So you have to draw over to the y-axis and drop down to the x-axis. So scholar is the least, yeah, I was right about it. Scholar is the least popular. So anyway, then the words that are, the cosine is the measure of those angles, right? So scholar and paper are closer to each other than scholar and rock and paper are closer to each other than scholar and rock, right? And I just made this stuff up. So I don't know for sure, but you could imagine that scholar is more, you know, more counts of obscure papers. Anyway, so the point here is that cosine measures distance between the target's meanings. And then what we do now, we don't only use 75 words, we could use like 2 million words, and then we compress down to like 600 dimensions or something. And that's called a word embedding, right? And that's exactly how latent semantic analysis works, which is the basic technology behind search engines and machine translation, things like that. Okay, so I don't know if that was all very clear. I hope it was somewhat clear. The big exciting thing was that we showed that if you train AI like that, if you just go through all this text that's on the internet or something, or whatever text you want to choose, then you're going to find these regularities. And it turns out that those regularities are the same as human implicit biases. In case you haven't had implicit bias training, that's something like, for example, this is just one, that you have, it's easier to, if you have this task that you need to push the left button, if you see either a female name or a career word, and then you have to push the right button if you have either a male name or a family word. In the best of all possible worlds, in a very fair world, that task would be just as hard as doing it the other way, female names and family words on one side and male names and career words on the other side, right? Unfortunately, we don't live in that world. It's far easier to pair up the male names with career words and the female names with the family words. And so by far easier, that, I don't know if you can see the D down there. D means that it's like measure of significance in terms of standard deviation. So it's more than one standard deviation away. These are just no way that they're the same group. And so it's clearly like a huge difference. And now totally differently, now we're not doing, you know, counting people pushing buttons anymore. We're just looking at the words, those angles of the words. But again, we're very certain that those are 2 different clusters of words. The female name cluster is way closer to the family cluster. And the male names are closer to the career words relative to the other way around. There's, again, huge impact. And that's off of only a small number of words, you know, and of 8. It's incredible for basket of words. All right, so that was already shocking enough. People were so amazed that computers could be computers. It's not the computer. It's our culture reflected back at us. But anyway, you know, AI was sexist and racist, and ageist and everything else. But anyway, my colleague, Arvind Narayanan, was up for tenure and was slightly freaked out by how good the results were and said, let's see this in terms of something I know is true. I want to know, I want to see, maybe he was just curious, I don't know. I just remember he was freaking out about it. So the other part was my idea. This was totally not my idea. This was his idea. And it never even occurred to me, but he was so right. So now the y-axis here is those evil sexist word embeddings that just totally replicated human implicit biases. And the x-axis is the actual US labor statistics. And the thing is that some of the US labor statistics, the title of the job had 2 words, like domestic engineer. And then we would just throw away the adjective. So that's why there's some noise in there. but basically, it's incredibly accurate, right? Incredibly highly correlated. So what that indicates is that AI trained on human language replicates not only implicit biases, but our actual lived experience, right? And which is actually what some of the people on the right had been claiming for a while, that you're trying to construct a new reality here. And I think we have to grab that. I think we have to admit, yes, our implicit behavior is not our ideal behavior. The ideals are something that we use. That literally the word means. It's something we've explicitly communicated. It's a plan that we have and that we've negotiated, right? So that's the difference between explicit and implicit. We shouldn't be surprised that there's a reason there's these two systems. Our intelligence is bootstrapped off of the implicit, off of what we observe, because we got to start somewhere. But then we make plans to do something better than where we currently are. And that includes collectively coming up with agreements about what's a stereotype. All right, so in the last 10 minutes, I'm going to talk to you about the last 10 minutes of my talk, so Q&A. I'm going to talk to you about polarization and inequality, which is my most recent paper. And we're going to come back to the chimpanzees again. All right. Oh, but not right away. Sorry, there's no more pictures of chimpanzees, but it's a similar problem, right? But anyway, polarization. But we don't even have to talk about polarization. Let's talk about income inequality. That's on the x-axis here. And you can see high is on the right. And then somewhat confusingly, bad health. Bad health and social problems is the high is on the x-axis, on the y-axis there, right? So of course we see, and this is 2011 data. I'm sure some of these numbers have moved around, but it probably popped out to you, the USA up there in the upper right corner of my home. I know I have an ambiguous accent because I'm from Wisconsin, but no, I am American. And then down here we have Germany. I'm even fluent in British, so I'm really confusing. I get called a Canadian a lot. Anyway, Germany, where I currently live, is down here, and of course Canada is there, not too far, well clustered with the rest of Europe, not over there with those bad Five Eyes guys, the rest of the Five Eyes. So anyway, this is back to, again, American data, because of our primitive two-party democracy, because of the first past the post stuff. So this is actually a graph showing polarization, political polarization versus income inequality. The dark gray is what proportion of income went to the top 1% of earners. And we know that from when America did that brilliant thing, which was called prohibition. So when they had to replace alcohol tax with income tax. Okay, so that from that point, we have this data. And then the gray data is polarization, looking at when the two parties cooperate in Congress. And they also looked at all the states for more evidence. And we have that data going back through the 19th century. It's one of several data sources we can do to see how polarization has changed over much longer periods. And if we believe this correlation, then we could also get some ideas about what happens with inequality. And there's, again, some other indicators with that. Anyway, what you see happening here is that after one world war and one financial crash, enough of the US elite, not all, but enough of the US elite signed up with the proletariat. So we had FDR and the New Deal. We had this decline in political polarization that was able to then bring down the income inequality, also partly because of World War II, of course, but you can see that it persists beyond that. But the New Deal was massive. I mean, and it only gave money to white uneducated males. But I think that was because they thought those were the guys that were getting to, that were too much of a risk because of that nasty Marx person that put ideas in people's heads. And the reason I think that is because look at what happened in 1978. All of a sudden, and people go around going, oh, the great decoupling, what happened? Why in 1978 did wages stop going up with productivity? Well, I bring this slide to show that it's not a great decoupling. There's a great coupling that happened for a while. And so there had been policy that we had enacted that we, for some reason, let go of. And my guess about why we let go of that is because that's about when economists knew that the Soviet economy had plateaued, so that Marx wasn't right, at least not as implemented by the Soviet Union. So that's my guess. But anyway, let's do another exciting build here. what I've already told you. Well, first of all, why was there inequality? It isn't just AI, right? The inequality was not driven by AI. And that was why I first got into this research. People ask me on live television, like, is AI causing inequality? I'm like, I don't know. Right? But I said, but nothing much happened in 1978 with AI. I mean, there was some, but anyway, now we think that whenever you implement a technology, you invent a new technology that reduces the cost of distance, including like riding horses, things like that, then suddenly you're going to have fewer winners, right? And so you're going to face increased concentrations of wealth. And so before it was oil, rail, and telegraph. Now it's digital. Not only digital, finance, pharma, aerospace. There's a few things that really distance doesn't matter very much. Anyway, I mentioned this already about great coupling, that we did all kinds of things in 1945. It wasn't just FDR anymore, but globally we blocked transnational extraction of wealth, and we managed to hold on to that for a couple of decades. So like I said, we have to realize, and I'm trying to communicate that to the elite now too, that it's in everybody's interest to reduce the amount of volatility we're currently experiencing. And also incidentally, this is not saying, oh, we all need to go totally socialist. Empirically, there's no theory behind this, but a Gini coefficient around 0.27 seems to be the best. So the empirical data is actually across different countries about social stability and Gini coefficients, but it's harder to do the exact political polarization thing, but it does. It translates okay. Let's put it that way, and I can give you more references about that later. Okay, so so anyway, judging from that work, it does seem to reward innovation. In fact, I don't have that figure here, but we had a figure in the paper about this. Anyway, get this paper. This is the paper, and it actually does cite. We wound up not doing a lot of international stuff because someone else had just done it and it was in a preprint, but we cited in this paper. And then, like I said, that Gini, the 0.27 Gini thing, that's also done globally. So you can find both of those papers in this paper, but I can't remember the name of the authors, I apologize. But anyway, we knew there's a correlation, we didn't know why. And so what I worked on with another modeler and an expert in this domain was trying to understand why. And so this is why I couldn't decide if there was another. This is not a real experiment on real people. It's just like kind of a weird similar thing with agents, with AI agents. So here the idea is that we have two groups, an in-group and an out-group. Well, actually it's just two groups, and they're both their own in-group, and then they look at the other as an out-group. And you get a higher reward if you work with the out-group, but you also have a higher probability of collapse of cooperation. In fact, Alex Stewart, who was the first author on this paper, he's also the same guy who did the gerrymandered minds. He was the first author on that paper, Covered Nature, which slowed down this paper getting out. But anyway, he had the great insight that we just decided to pretend that if you do in-group cooperation, it always works, 100%. So then you only have to vary the probability of out-group interaction failing. And you have this question about exactly how much the difference is. But we're going to assume, again, based on empirical studies, we know that you tend to do better, you have better reward when you work with a more diverse group. You can solve more problems. But we're going to guess that, like I said, that there's going to be an increased. That's just our guess. We don't have evidence of that, but we're just guessing that it's harder to make cooperation work if you know less about the others, if you have more trouble modeling them. Okay, so the outcome, once we make that assumption, is that when an economy offers poor support, particularly or declining support, so that people are suddenly in the risk of having a big catastrophic failure event, then it can actually become more important to avoid risk than to maximize revenue. Okay, so it's really about a declining economy with big catastrophic failures, and inequality isn't the main point. The main point, inequality just is similar for most people in the cases where it's allowed to create false scarcity. So if the rich are getting so much money that everybody else is getting not that much money. Okay, so in this context, so this is the graph of the outcome. We start off setting the experiment so that on the right side there, where there's a high quality environment, that you're better off working with the out group if you have anything more than half of the experiments cooperations working. Okay, so that's why there's the red blue is perfectly divided. We set it up that way on the far right there for the very high quality environment. So then as the quality of the environment declines, then you're actually, again, in danger of falling off of some kind of a economic cliff. Then it becomes a less and less good idea to interact with the out group unless you have a very high probability of success. But then I had been worried because I knew of some biological examples of increased risk taking when things are really bad, and so it turns out that if you know for a fact that you're not going to do well, right? So if you've gotten to the point where in-group cooperation is never going to help you because the economy's gotten that bad, then you have to gamble for redemption. So that's when that's why you get actually an increase of working with the out group, because things have gotten that bad, basically. So when we talk about these discontinuities that can cause this, there's things like fear of bankruptcy, foreclosure, divorce, losing children, having them taken away by the state or whatever, or death, starvation, things like that. All right. So this is just to draw in case I should probably go. I'm out of time. So anyway, I hope I was clear enough. But yeah, it's the idea that I will do the whole thing. If the narrow thing is the narrower amount of risk, but the less good payoff is the red one there is supposed to be working with your in-group. And then if you're worried about falling off the cliff, then you stop investing in the higher expected payoff. But once you're already over the cliff, then you gamble for redemption and go for, again, the higher expected payoff, which coincidentally also just happens to be slightly better level of risk. The big problem with this is that, now this is the same thing over again with time now on the x-axis. The big problem with this is that, not in this graph. First, I'll explain this graph. So the y is the probability of working with the in-group, and even there's two, and the environmental quality on the purple is on the second y-axis there. And so as the environmental quality comes down, as you said, you polarize, then you unpolarize, and you polarize again. Okay, that's not realistic. It turns out that if you add to the model the simple modification that when you cooperate with others, they have to agree to cooperate with you. You just add in that one piece, then you get this. You get that that it's, once you get polarized, it's very hard to unpolarize, and that seems to reflect the real world data more. So so the only thing that seems to get people over this hurdle now is something like war, invasion, disaster, maybe a pandemic. So you have to reestablish your national identity or whatever, your larger group identity through something like that. Okay, so that's everything I was going to talk about, but I should say, even though I'm over time, what can we do? Remember to invest in the public goods. Yeah, it is possible. This is not a zero-sum game, no matter what some guy at Davos says, on television. There's only one guy that said that. Most people at Davos know something about public goods. I wanted to point out these guys down here. Norway is like the go-to example of how not to experience a resource curse, right? In contrast to like Saudi Arabia. When you discover oil, it can cause lots of problems, or you can just say, hey, we better make sure we redistribute. And so we don't have that kind of problem that I just mentioned. Historically, Norway's been that way. I don't know if it's still doing as well. But as of up till 2011, Lafera Scott apparently means I'm okay with paying tax because it rocks to be Norwegian. I don't maybe you can correct me on that. So in contrast, the country of my deliberately accepted passport was unfortunately did suffer resource curse, regulatory capture. And it wasn't by oil, although we have a little bit up in the North Sea, it was by the financial sector. And so people in London just didn't somehow notice after 2000 the extent to which They're completely impoverishing the rest of the country, and then they wind up with a highly polarized country. So I threw in something about this, that some of the problems here are about overextension of legal personality, again, that happened after the end of the Cold War. Maybe people thought they didn't need to worry about things too much. That might be a form of regulatory capture. And what I'm particularly concerned about is people who think it's a good idea to make AI itself responsible for itself. That would be the ultimate regulatory capture, right? Because it's the ultimate shell machine, shell game, shell company, right? Because there's nothing that would care. You're basically saying, if you make, the European Parliament proposes, if you make a sufficiently complicated AI, then maybe you should think about giving it, legal personality. It's like, oh yeah, that's great. Tell companies that if they make a product that they can't understand, they can't control, and they can't document what it's doing, then they have lower tax liabilities and lower legal liabilities. Oh, what a great idea. That's just like asking to destroy society. So anyway, don't do that. Right. And yeah, remember the world isn't really binary. And I'm sorry, I forgot there's yet another paper in here. Me and a friend got pissed off at these kinds of figures where basically people were trying to tell Europe that we had no power and we should just roll over and be friends with America. Now, notice this is disinformation. It's calling Asia China is just wrong. So we made a figure that was right. And what we did was we said, and we also what is a platform? Nobody knows, right? So we just said anybody who had at least 2 AI patents in 2019, because it saved time over one, right? At least 2. So the Y, again, log here, the y-axis is the number of patents, the x-axis is the market cap, which is what that previous figure was based on, was market caps. And what you see here is, of course, that those are both terrible. Yeah, because some companies are playing the patent game and others aren't. It's not that Apple doesn't innovate, it's that Apple doesn't think the court's the right way to protect its innovation. And similarly, some countries don't think that allowing enormous market capitalization around is a good idea. In fact, it was the US who decided that in the 1890s. They said, oh, geez, if you have too much power, that's bad for democratic governance. Yeah, well, thank you. We all agreed with that until the 70s. And you can see, I think there's no way it's a coincidence that Alibaba and Tencent are on top of each other there. China has decided, yes, and Saudi has just recently, their Aramco thing, they've decided to have their national champions and to play whatever the game is that America is playing with these large market cap companies. Europe does not have large market cap companies by and large. The largest ones in Europe are actually Swiss, and there's only 8 million people in Switzerland, so it's not, Anyway, so first of all, it's not binary because the rest of the world is actually not doing that much worse. If you look at, for example, the rest of the world, there's at least 4 regions here. But secondly, America doesn't need help. So the people that are saying, oh, there's this Cold War, oh my God, we need to make sure we don't, the EU doesn't threaten the United States. No. If anything, we should be helping them with that problem on that first graph I had in that section. So anyway, thanks for your attention and sorry for going a few minutes over there.
All right, thanks so much, Joanna. It looks like Jillian has had a bit of a Wi-Fi issue, so I'm going to be moderating the discussion here. Maybe if you wanted to stop, perfect. I was going to say if you wanted to stop sharing your screen, but you're already ahead of me on that. So if anybody has any questions, I know there are a couple in the chats. Feel free to use the hand raise function under the reactions. And we can...
Could you just give me a second? I want to switch my sound over to the,
absolutely.
more natural way.
Yeah, we'll just let people queue up while we're waiting.
Hi there. I dropped for a while there and I don't know where we are in the process. Have we started discussion here?
Just about. Yeah, we're just finishing up with chat. Some people are queuing up, and we're about to start the discussion.
Okay, all right.
Ready. Okay. I was just fixing the sound thing so I could put the laptop down without making lots of noise.
Okay, all right, Travis. So I'll just jump back into chair, but you'll be ready to jump in if my Wi-Fi goes out again.
If need be.
Okay, thanks a lot. Joanna, thanks. I missed the very end. It was all looking great. And we have a couple of questions. I'm gonna go to Ashton Anderson first.
Yeah, well, I have so many questions because you covered so much stuff. So thank you for that wide-ranging talk. No, it was great. It was great. I guess I was wondering, especially, I mean, you take a number of different methodological approaches, which is always really nice. So wondering in particular about the simulation studies, if there's any way to try and situate them in data, kind of like fit them to data, or whether you can kind of design interventions or something based on them, especially the polarization one. I'm wondering if you had found some other term that would help us get out of a polarization.
No, I think that's really an important thing to do. And I really, in fact, I have several dissertation students now at Hertie School that are looking at this, and I'm hoping at least one of them, with master students, I shouldn't say if you guys are master students, but like 1 in 3 master students trying to pan out. So I'm hoping 3 is enough. So in the paper, there is actually an empirical component, and that's what I was mentioning. We were looking at double checking that affective polarization. So not only political polarization correlates with inequality. And we originally going to do it globally, and then we found somebody else already had, so we just did it by US state and across, and it did. But it was kind of crazy because that was just a snapshot. So what I'm really interested in now is this stuff would predict that all these interventions, so there's so many people that are convinced, and they get so angry at you if you tell them they're wrong, that it's social media itself that's causing the polarization, as if there's never been polarization before. And there's components to it. Again, it's part of that feedback cycle for sure. But basically, there's no correlation between the amount that you participate in social media and how polarized you are. There are people that use social media as a vector for increasing polarization, right? So again, it wasn't about how much time were you there at all, but like WhatsApp in Brazil, incredible. But the inequality in Brazil at that time was like 60.6 Gini coefficient. It was just incredible. And so anyway, there are, again, there's complexities and things on the far right. In America, the far right, interestingly, in Canada, somebody did a study, and it was the very far right and the very far left that did really have those reinforcement loops. But for the vast majority in the middle, it's not correlated at all. And so anyway, the point is that so then people try to do these interventions where they chat at each other and they build bridges. And my prediction would be that those aren't going to help unless you've already got enough stability that you don't have to have that other fear. But if you've already started economic recovery, then this could actually really help a lot, right? So maybe you don't need a war then, right? So that's what I'd like to do, is go out and see, just do a lit review of who's actually succeeded, who's had greater success with those kinds of interventions, or having an Olympics or whatever else. Whether that correlates to where they were in their economic cycles. So that would be my biggest prediction out of that.
Right. Did you say there that there's a study that showed the extreme left and the extreme right? There's some evidence of social media reinforcing them? Is that what you?
Yeah. So the main thing I know about it is Andrew Guess's paper. Okay. That was like Andrew Guess and a couple of people, and they showed that it was only on the far right, that there was very far right. There was a little bit of a cycle of people really. Well, the main thing was that they were showing that. So again, polarization. People would say they were reading this really extremist stuff, but actually they're all just reading centrist stuff. Right. But the exception was there was actually this echo chamber very far on the far right. But then I was just at a conference with someone and said, oh, we tried to replicate that, and we showed that it was like the far left and the far right, and they were Canadian. So I guess somebody, but I can't remember their names, I'm sorry. You go look at it. I'm sure there's a lot of people who have cited that paper by now and said they were wrong or something. So you just have to try to dig up some of that. I apologize. You have to search the search the citing papers.
Sure.
But yeah, or ask Andrew, guess he probably knows because they've probably hated on him on Twitter or something.
Will do. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Ashton. Thank you, Joanna. Brian.
Which one's Brian?
Oh, hi. Sorry, I didn't have my hand up. But I don't know if it's me. Are there other Brians?
So, oh, it was you, but I thought you were lined up ahead of time. You can see if you have a question, but I've got a couple of hands here. I'll go to Ron.
Yeah, no, go ahead with the hands. Go ahead with the hands.
Okay, sure.
Well, building on that, I was really interested, John, I enjoyed your talk, a lot of fascinating topics. I'm curious, you know, in the preface, you're talking about the OECD principles, and you held up the example of Michael Flynn and Cambridge Analytica. And I love how you would unpack the ethics and responsibilities there, right? Into, you know, the data use, algorithms at Facebook. I think we could all hold out that Cambridge Analytica had some ethical challenges in various things, but you know, the broader frame, I'd love your unpacking that a little bit on the ethics and how those principles sort of apply.
Okay, that's a great question. Wow, no one's asked that one to me before. So the basic thing was that yeah, like I said, the Cambridge Analytica, yeah, there was some people. So the ICO in the UK found them guilty of using people's data in a way that they hadn't predicted, which I thought was the most toothless kind of like illegal thing. But when you really, like, nobody thought that liking cats was going to be something that was going to make you a political target, right? But let's see, actually, I'm going to now go back to my talk and pull back up I think that the main idea, well, yeah, respect for the rule of law. There were so many laws those guys were breaking, and you heard, like I said, you heard General Flynn talking about the running an insurgency against his own country. So that's illegal. Yeah. So the basic ideas about this was the achievements of the OECD stuff was getting people really, and I feel like it's another version of the OECD, of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, because you're basically emphasizing the importance of human-centeredness, right, and human knowledge. So you're saying that we have a right to know how, when we're interacting with an agent, like a artificial agent versus a real human, and what the basis of our decisions, how did we get targeted, what is our advertising, how is advertising taken. So I think in a way it doesn't solve the problem. This is like, again, I'm sorry, I don't know that much about Canadian law. In American law, if you come, they used to make you say something like you've never been a member of the Communist Party on the airplane ticket. And it wasn't that they cared about who was in the Communist Party, it was that they needed a reason to deport you. And I think that basically anyone who's doing that level of kinds of problems, of manipulations, would wind up running afoul of these sort of central principles. But I also think that the OECD principles, they're not laws, they're ideals that we're writing laws toward, but just getting people on the same side about that AI, because so we used to think, and I don't know if you're a computer scientist, we used to think in AI and HCI that computer systems should be invisible. You shouldn't know that they're there, that's transparency, unfortunately, in HCI means like complete lack of appearance. And now we're saying, no, people have to be informed, or at least to have chosen to be uninformed. So it's okay to walk into a movie and think, I'm going to immerse myself for a while. But you have to know what was available to you. And so I think that was the thing that, and there's also the transhumanists. So we were battling people that were trying to make sure that European car companies didn't have to compete against Google and Apple for their liability issues, and that thought that humans had a right to live forever or whatever, and that we should upload ourselves into machines and that would solve that. And so those kind of unholy coupling. And so what my colleagues and I were saying was like, don't break, as I said here, don't break society that way legally. But that really annoys the people who think that they already are robots, or believe that they're not going to. I meet these people. I meet them in like small meetings of top academics at UCLA. You know that you run into. I was in a room and somebody said, "There's 20 people in this room that understand. The 20 people in the world understand AI, and none of them are in this room. Maybe that guy over there." And that guy over there said, I disclaim what was just said. But anyway, and you guys don't realize we're going to have energy independence within 10 years. Everything you're worried about is out the window, and there are those people who believe that. And unfortunately, there's more of them in Silicon Valley than you want to know. So getting to the point where we were talking about people being the core point, and just bringing it back into the Sustainable Development Goals. In some way, these things are just two different triangulations onto the same thing, which is saying, let's keep a lot of people alive. And I feel like the other side is the side that's saying, the rules are just slowing us down. We want to gather as much resource as possible. We like money laundering. We like using real estate to money launder, whatever, and we don't care if most people die. What we just heard in Brazil, if most people die, we should stop whining about it, because it's not really that many people die of COVID or whatever. I actually feel like there's some. But I'm sorry, maybe I shouldn't go.
I was just going to say, we have 3 people with hands up, and we've got 10 minutes. So I thought, let's get those in and short, brief answers. Jack.
Yeah, sorry about that. That was it was too good of a question. That's why
I know. Ron does the good ones. Yeah. Got it. Jack, go ahead.
I had a straightforward question and an open-ended one, but I'll just stick with the straightforward one in light of the queue. I'm curious about the interpretation of the one of the trust results early on in the presentation. Okay. Specifically just the interpretation of the trust game, and when people, knowing that their opponent tends to give less than an equal division of the troublesome, refuses to take the opportunity even when it seems likely to be an advantage. And you said they were punishing, and implicitly that there's a motivation of some kind of altruistic or maybe just spiteful punishment motivation. And I wondered if it's not likely that knowing that someone is not giving you an even division reduces the likelihood that they'll give you anything profitable at all, because there isn't a sort of stable focal point for what they're going to do if it's not, all or nothing or 50-50.
No, that totally makes sense to me. I can tell you, I have a review article from about the period when we were doing that work with Carolina Sylvester, who's the first author also on this other paper, which is not out yet. but the paper that is out, there isn't a difference between, at least there's not a psychological lived experience difference between the spite and altruism. So that they just define altruism in terms of its outcome, but the people who are doing it often feel very, very angry. So they're not like friendly hippie people that are sacrificing themselves willingly, whatever. They're just mad, and they go and do that. So you're right about that part. But with respect to the if you've heard this about somebody that they tend to pay this dodgy point, yeah, sure, I could believe psychologically that could be the reasoning. One of the things that the economists don't, they assume that you believe them for some reason, and so there's this whole thing about the validity of the microeconomics, and some people just try to challenge it all. But then the question is, if it's if it doesn't have any validity, then why does it have such regularities? Like, for example, the GDP thing. It turned out actually that even the implicit bias research, which had, like I said, these gigantic effect sizes, it was one of the best established effect in psychology. People had decided that they don't believe anything experimental psychology anymore. And because explicit biases and implicit bias were not predicted by implicit biases, they were throwing that baby out with that bathwater, just saying, oh, we don't believe anything in psychology. And so actually, while I thought that we were using something that was completely sound in psychology to ground an understanding of AI, it actually turned out that we used a second method to triangulate on a psychological phenomenon to sort of reclaim the implicit bias literature. I totally hadn't seen that coming, but that was what happened. So that's the nature of science sometimes. I feel like I'm being even loopier than usual. I am a bit of a loopy person, but it is late here.
Yeah, that's right. We appreciate that. Yeah, it's getting late. Although it still looks sunny in Berlin, so that's nice to know that it's.
Well, it's not. It's 9:30 now, and but the other thing is that I got a global partnership for AI meeting after this. So
oh gosh,
it's
okay.
happened to line up to the same night, so that's great. We may as well keep talking.
I am going to jump to Brian, and then if we have time, we'll come back to Avery. But I'm not sure we'll get there. But Brian, go ahead.
Well, thanks. Sorry, I just had so many questions before. I didn't know which one I wanted to ask. But so there's this, you did something which actually a lot of people do in AI, which is to cite Wittgenstein in terms of meaning as use as a kind of rationale for this idea that meaning can actually be discussed in terms of its, these proximity metrics in high dimensional spaces of word use. And Wittgenstein scholars that I know, and I know quite a few, are just appalled at this idea that Wittgenstein is being used as a rationale for thinking that meaning has to do with the correlation between the use of some words and the use of other words. That, Wittgenstein's bricklayer and so on and so forth, the meaning has to do with actually getting the hod out and putting mortar on the bricks and so on and so forth. It's actually grounded in the world activity. So I don't think that's actually, it doesn't do justice to Wittgenstein. Now our project is not to do Wittgenstein scholarship, but it raises a real issue, I think, which is that, as you were saying, the databases of words that we use actually build in a lot of these biases, and not just biases, but prejudices and stereotypes and prejudices and so on and so forth. And if we use these databases of words as models of what the words mean, then we're going to end up with views of what the words mean that in fact build in a lot of biases and prejudices and stuff. And it seems to me that then we're likely to not be able to see that these things are prejudicial or stereotypical and so on and so forth, because there's no external control on the use of the words. And I have in general real doubt about thinking that you can get at what words are meaning just internal. But this is a very particular question with respect to your work, that it seems to me there's a real issue of getting at stereotypes and prejudices and stuff, just looking at correlations within the realm of word use.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm sorry, I'm going to disagree with you on about 3 grounds. First of all, Wittgenstein. I'm not a major Wittgenstein scholar, but as I understand, he wrote 2 books that said the opposite things. And I have to admit that I actually knew this more from Quine, and then I added Wittgenstein because I felt guilty about not citing the original source. But he apparently changed his mind over the period between his 2 papers. And actually, there was this other guy in Cambridge, Ramsey, that was one of the big people that helped him change his mind. But then he claimed that he'd always meant that. But anyway, so the lesson, as you said, we're not doing Wittgenstein here. You've slightly got the wrong end of the stick with respect to what I was trying to do. I wasn't looking for prejudice because I cared about prejudice. This work actually came out of my evolution of communication studies, and then everybody who thought, oh, you do AI ethics, suddenly decided, oh, you're a woman and you do AI ethics, this must be like a feminist thing. And of course, my feminist side is interested in it. But the point is that this is grabbing enough about semantics that we can tell things like that, that you can type in words and get what you want on a search page. I mean, it used to be that an example of what you couldn't get out of computers was things like a Turing test question was like, since the holidays, the scale has become my enemy. It's like, no AI from the 20th century AI could tell that you were talking about weight. In fact, a lot of non-native English speakers can't tell you that you're talking about weight. But now you type that into Google and you actually get me telling the story. But before I did that to a journalist, you would get the word weight would come back with 5 of the top 10 hits. So the point is that you are getting at some aspect of what it is that what we are using, what we're leveraging, and what our lived experience is. And there's a huge thing right now. Look up stochastic parrots. There's a huge thing about like, oh, we're consolidating, and the Obama administration is very worried about this. We're consolidating the outcomes of history and tying it down now with the machines. That's only true if you don't keep updating it. And so what some people are trying to do is trying to find these ideal societies where they absorb those sets of understandings. And my issue with that as an ethicist is that there's what the fundamental rights people call tensions. There's an awful lot of tensions. There isn't an innumerable set of potential stereotypes or ways that we can be unfair. And there's constant renegotiations that have to happen. So you're not going to find a perfect data set. But I do believe that you will find that you can use these data sets to get a pretty good image, a snapshot of how people are using language at a time. But yeah, so I think you just had it slightly, what I was doing slightly reversed there. But you're slightly, I think we should let the okay.
Yeah, I'm going to intervene here just because we like to end on time, and but Brian, please feel free. Yeah, but please, we can stay on and continue to chit chat like we were in a normal room, and we could have that conversation. But anyway, I wanted to thank you, Joanna, for a terrific talk. Really enjoyed that, and thank you everybody for joining us. Next week, Dennis Walsh, one of our research leads, will be talking on the normative perspective. So stay tuned for some great further discussions. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Joanna.